Theory students, this week we have a bit of a challenge. We return back to Plato, and we, for this week, are engaging with books 1 and 2 of what's known as the Republic of Plato, which is this really thick book. So you're reading just a small part of it, although you're reading quite a bit of it, and it is a challenge to get through. And so I'm going to try and provide some clarity here about what this actually means and what this looks like. So for Plato here, we return to a dialogue format. So we saw the dialogue format with the Crito, and Plato, who was telling us the stories and trials of Socrates, writes in the forms of dialogues. Here in the Republic, we have a dialogue between Socrates and several of his friends and acquaintances. Right? And so book 1 starts out with Socrates speaking and setting the scene for us. He says, we have I'm using a different version than you guys are using, just because it's easier for me. This is already marked up, so I'm going to read. So it might be slightly different, the wording and phrasing, than what you read, but it's essentially the same stuff. So Socrates begins. I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, son of Ariston, to pray to the goddess, and at the same time I wanted to observe how they would put on the festival, since they were now holding it for the first time. Okay? So we get a few things here, a few tidbits here from the very first line. I went down to the Piraeus. So this is past tense, right? So this is a reflection upon what happened the previous day. Right? I went down to the Piraeus yesterday. The Piraeus is the outside market. It's like by the waterfront in ancient Greece. It's like the shipyards. So there's constantly new things coming in, and in ancient times there wasn't a whole lot to do. So people would go down to like the docks where ships were coming in to see all the new stuff that was being brought in because of trade. And he went down with Glaucon, who's a politician, right? Glaucon is the son of Ariston. Ariston is also the father of Plato. So Glaucon is Plato's brother. So Socrates goes down to the shipyard with Glaucon, the brother of Plato. He went to pray to the gods and observe how they would put on the new festivals since they were holding it for the first time. So there's new things happening. All new things are being introduced, and so Socrates is out there like trying to see what's going on. So it's like a normal day, and then he's convinced by people that he needs to go to a party. They need to go have like an all-night binger is basically what they're talking about having. So he shows up, and there's all these people there, and they begin to have a discussion. And Socrates is very hesitant because he's like, I don't know if I want to have a discussion with you guys, because I'm not sure if you'll listen to me. And they're like, no, we promise to listen to you. Socrates is kind of annoying. If you haven't picked it up yet, Socrates is kind of annoying. And so they want to think about justice. And so what we get in books 1 and 2 are different conceptions of justice, right? So the whole book, the Republic, it's all, however many hundreds of pages this is all about what is justice. That's the theme of the book. What is justice? And so we get different conceptions of what justice is. And so, here for Socrates, he is engaged in dialogue with people at this essentially like giant kegger. Instead of keg, it's wine, beer, it's wine. About what justice is. And he gets these competing arguments that are made about what justice is. And Socrates never tells us what he thinks justice is. What he does is he spends his time questioning people and what they think to prove that they're idiots. Right? If we can summarize the motto of Socrates in one short phrase, it's everyone is an idiot. That's what Socrates is telling them, that people don't know what they're talking about. And so everyone who sort of pushes forward this idea of what they think is truth and goodness and justice, Socrates sets out to prove them all wrong. Because he clearly has a conception in his mind of what is the right thing to do, what is justice. The biggest push for what justice is in Book 1 is made by a man named Thrasymachus. And so Thrasymachus claims that justice is the advantage of the stronger. So the strong in society pushing forward their personal selfish beliefs and imposing them upon everyone else. And about half of Book 1 is this exchange between Thrasymachus and Socrates. Right? I'm not going to go into all the details here. Please make sure to read it. That's the most important part of Book 1. Justice, Thrasymachus says, applies only to elites, and that elites, specifically elites in government, create laws and rules for their own benefit, and they create society for the benefit of themselves, to the disadvantage of everyone else. And so it is more profitable, Thrasymachus says, to be unjust. Being unjust makes you stronger. It's actually wise and virtuous to be unjust, because if you're in a position of power, you will advantage yourself. And so everyone should be out for their own selfish interests. That's what it means to be just. Okay? And Socrates spends a lot of time questioning Thrasymachus and saying, is this really true? Right? Is injustice really more profitable than justice? And Thrasymachus keeps responding, right? Keeps lobbing volley after volley at Socrates, and it makes very compelling arguments here. I'm wondering how compelling you think Thrasymachus' arguments here. Obviously, Socrates is not convinced, but it's not uncommon for people to read this and think, yeah, Thrasymachus is right, even though Socrates will eventually rebut him. And here we go, Thrasymachus, people don't fear injustice because they think injustice is bad. They fear it because of punishments, right? People do good because they fear being punished. And so there's all sorts of arguments here that are made by Thrasymachus that you may think are compelling. And so, we get to a point where Socrates says that Thrasymachus has inverted vices and virtues, that what we normally consider virtues are actually bad, and that vices are good. We'll see this also with Machiavelli, right? And so we get this constant back and forth, and then Socrates eventually turns the tables on him, because Socrates says that cities are a reflection of the people that live there. Because cities are made up of people. And so if all the people who live in cities are terrible, awful people, then cities would be terrible, awful places. When they're not really, right? And also we wouldn't want to live in a place that is terrible and awful. We want to live in a place that is good. And so Socrates isn't convinced, right? He says, injustice, if everyone was unjust, we would have constant fighting in cities. Cities would not be safe. Cities would be terrible, awful places. No one would want to live there, right? We would not have the loyalty of the gods, right? The gods don't believe in injustice. The gods believe in justice. Why would gods protect cities full of unjust people? And so what we're eventually left with here is Socrates saying that we need to further investigate justice, because justice is critical to our souls as to who we are as people. And so this is the beginning of an endeavor to determine what justice looks like. In Book 2, we get other conceptions of justice, right? Glaucon, right, the politician, poses what many people consider to be an early example of social contract theory, right? Glaucon essentially says in Book 2 that justice is people agreeing to lay down their ability to do whatever they want in exchange for obedience to the laws, right? In order to escape the injustices of the world, people agree to give up their ability to engage in dishonest acts, and they agree to give that up to a government that will create laws and rules and police society. Socrates rejects this. Socrates uses the example of the ring of Gyges, and he says here in Book 2, suppose someone found a ring that made you invisible. What would that person do with it? And he tells the story of this farmer who finds the ring and does all these terrible, awful things. And Socrates says, one of the problems with what you're proposing, Glaucon, is that you're proposing that everyone's just like the farmer, right? If there weren't rules, if there weren't people watching, if there weren't the threats of punishment, people would do terrible, awful things. But that doesn't seem like a good way to run society. right? We need to create a society, Socrates says, where we value justice for its own sake, where we value the good because it's good. Right? It's not enough to simply not do bad because you're worried about being caught or because there's a government that might punish you. Right? That means deep down we're all terrible, awful people. So we're back to Thrasymachus, right? People are terrible and bad, and that people don't do good things because they're worried about like image or being caught. Just man is not someone who simply does things out of obedience to the laws. The just man is someone who does things because it's the right thing to do. And the question is, how do we create society to get just people who will always act out of the right sense of what to do? And, if we're looking for the right sense of what to do, we have to figure out what society ought to look like. Because the society is a collection of people. We need to figure out what people in society ought to behave like and what society ought to do in order to get people to behave in a particular way and to believe and internalize conceptions of right and wrong. Justice in man is reflected in justice in the city and vice versa. So if we have just people, we will have a just society. And if we have a just society, we will produce just people. And so book 2 is the beginnings here of how we create the just city and the just people. Right? So we've sort of, in some ways, Socrates up to this point is just sort of rebutting people's arguments. And here we start to get what Socrates actually thinks. And the whole rest of the book is what Socrates actually thinks in response to all these people. Cities are natural. Communities are natural. Right? That's the ancient position. Socrates accepts that here. Cities, for the most part, today are sad places. They're sorrowful places because people don't value the right things. People value the wrong things. They value things that have necessity. We have cities of sorrow, Socrates says. But what we need to do is focus on the souls of individuals. And we need to think of people as we think of puppies, right? We train puppies. We train puppies to be smart and loyal and obedient, and we ought to think of people in the same way. We don't want, we want people to be spirited. We want people to be smart, and we want people to be loyal. And so we need to teach people, just like we teach dogs, right, to value good things and not do bad things. We need to teach people to value good things and not do bad things. It's not enough to just say, oh, well, the gods will take care of it, right, or anything like that. The city itself must take charge and create a society where people will value good things and people will not value bad things. This is the beginning of what will later become the argument for philosopher kings, right? That philosophers, and this is talked about, I think, in the first video about Plato, that since philosophers know the good, the true, the beautiful, right, they ought to rule because they can set rules that will help people value good, true, and beauty. Okay, there's obviously a lot more in here to unpack. People spend. When I was in grad school, there was a whole year-long class just on this book. Right, we've got a week on the first 2 books, and I only have 15 minutes for this video because that's all the time my software allows. So, there's obviously a lot more here, but those are some key points that I want you to focus on when you're reading books 1 and 2 of the Republic.